I am 28 years old, married, with a baby girl on the way. I'm very happy. However, there is an experience from my childhood that haunts me to this day. I was in the 8th grade, and my mother, sisters and I had fallen on hard times. We bounced between a shelter and a friend's house. After my mom started dating the man who would later become my stepfather, we all moved into a house together. I was ecstatic. I would finally have my own space. But as soon as I walked into that place, my happiness dissipated. It was like a jolt of electricity went through me. Everywhere in that house, I felt uneasy. Bizarrely, the most comfortable place to be in that building was the basement. The first thing you should know about this house is that the upstairs was totally sealed off. All of the doors to the upstairs were painted over and nailed shut. The only explanation we were ever given was that it was being rebuilt, a vague remark which was never elaborated upon. All I really know is that my sisters and I weren't allowed up there and that the doors were firmly nailed shut. One time my sisters and I tried to be brave and investigate, but the doors were so terrifying that we completely chickened out. The daytime in that house was uncomfortable, yet the nighttime was far worse. What was an uneasy feeling quickly turned into a paralyzing terror, absolute dread. The house always seemed so much darker than it should. The first incident I experienced there was of sleep paralysis. I would wake up, unable to scream or move anything but my eyes. And that wasn't very useful, as I've always had a bad stigmatism, needing glasses to see anything. Several times I woke up about 2 a.m., paralyzed and afraid to blink. Often I would hear my closet door quietly shut before being able to move again. The second time something happened, I was alone inside the house whilst my mother and sisters waited in the car. I was searching for something when I heard someone call my name. Thinking it was my mother yelling for me to hurry, I turned and went into her room, which was right next to the driveway, to tell her I was trying to hurry. What happened next still terrifies me. The door to the upstairs in my mother's room was open. Remember, these doors were not only painted over, but nailed shut. I heard my voice again, only this time it was a whisper, and it came from the stairs beyond the open door. I was so scared that I noped out my mum's bedroom window. For that, I was immediately grounded for lying and being dramatic. Later, when we got home, the door was now closed, but the paint was clearly broken and the nails lay all over the floor. This too resulted in me being grounded. I have no idea what spurred my mother to have us move, but shortly after this we moved to the next town over. I have never been so glad to move in my life. My freshman year at college was a difficult one. I was struggling with depression and anxiety. My long-term boyfriend and I were on the edge of a breakup, and my parents and I weren't speaking. I felt very alone, and I was looking for acceptance. My brother and I had shared some paranormal experiences when we were younger, which piqued our interest. So, when I found a paranormal group at college, I was interested. I joined them on one of their outings right away. The leader of the group was a Jewish man who made sure to pray over us before we went into the field. There was also another member who was our tech guy. He did all the audio recordings. Both were incredibly respectful, and for a college paranormal group, very professional. Besides myself, there was a new member to the group. They were new to the paranormal entirely. A decent way from the city centre, set into a hill, is Sensible Tunnel. This tunnel is surrounded by dark folklore and mystery. Stories have circulated for decades. Eerie sounds, crying and screaming, would reverberate out from the tunnel's dark centre. The most well-known story involves a botched robbery. Late one evening, a mysterious man travelling through the Tennessee hills stopped at a family farmhouse where he was invited in for dinner and shelter for the night. When the family caught him trying to steal their silverware later that night, the man ran for the door. But before he left, he grabbed their infant child, disappearing into the night. The father ran after him, only to find both the robber and his child dead in the tunnel. People say that the sounds of crying and screaming which can be heard there are those of the man and the infant. It has also been said that no one can walk through the tunnel at midnight without going insane or being attacked. Some even report a figure with red eyes lurking in its darkness. If there is one tunnel you should absolutely stay away from, it is the Sensible Tunnel. However, this is precisely where we headed. The tunnel has water running through it and a narrow ledge that can be walked along. I was the first of the group to enter, meaning I was the farthest into the darkness. The leader of the group started asking questions, whilst our tech guy recorded audio. He was being very respectful in his questioning. After just a few minutes, I started to hear what sounded like grunting and grumbling right beside me. It was very low at first, but slowly grew louder. I leaned close to the man next to me and asked him if he heard it too. He nodded. My heart froze. I grabbed his hand and held it for the rest of the time out of fear. Not moving, I continued to listen to the grumbling. It was intoxicating. I was both compelled and terrified. It was then that the other newcomer to the group began yelling into the tunnel. He was intentionally trying to provoke the spirit into a reaction. The last thing he said was, "Effing say something!" At that point, the grumbling voice was the loudest. Whatever was making that sound was clearly not happy. It was then that we decided it was best to leave. Later, when we returned to our dorm room, we listened to the audio that we had recorded. There were subtle noises, but suddenly, after our friend yelled "effing say something," there was a low but loud voice that said very clearly, "Shut up." It has now been 6 years since that day. Thinking about it still gives me the chills. I have not returned to that tunnel, but my interest in the paranormal has only grown since then. I come from a long line of psychics. My great-grandmother on my father's side could predict people's births and deaths and even read their auras. Similarly, my grandmother is able to make some predictions and read people's emotions. My dad was mostly the same. As a child, I quickly realized that I too had been born with a psychic ability. I could read people's emotions. Not only that, I could communicate with the dead. When I was a little girl, I would talk and play with my brother, who had died just a few years earlier. I would talk with a man named Charlie, who I claimed had died in World War I. In the backyard, I would often find a red-haired woman called Rose. My parents couldn't see or hear Charlie and Rose, so they assumed that they were just my imaginary friends. It was around this time that my parents rented a small house. They did not know anything about the history of the place, but they were very poor and we needed a place to live. From the very start, I disliked my room. In particular, I hated the closet. I said that there was something in there. And this wasn't just a childish fear. I genuinely believed that there was something in there. In fact, our dog, Dawn, would growl at the closet. The cats would avoid that area of the room if they could, which is saying something considering the cats love to explore every inch of that house. Just not there. Not that closet. When I was still young enough to need a crib, I would always want the crib to be next to the door, as far away from the closet as possible. Dad would say if they tried to move the crib or me to that area of the room, I would start screaming and crying. I would tell them that there was something bad in the closet. Of course, I was never believed, my protests all blamed on the overactive imagination of a child. I think the best way to describe the closet is that it was like a black hole. There was no specific emotion attached to it, just an infinite darkness. In that darkness was an evil, and it was always there. As I got older, if I had to get something out of my closet, I would lean over as far as I could to grab it, so I would have as little of my body as possible in that area. I always feared having to do that, as I was terrified that the entity would grab me. When we first moved in, my mother was severely depressed over the loss of my brother. My father dealt with their bereavement by drinking heavy liquor in an attempt to forget. If dark entities are attracted to emotional weakness, as I have been told that they are, our household was rife with sustenance. And me, the young child of the household, was the most vulnerable to target. My first encounter with this entity was when I was still in my crib. At the time, my crib was right next to the light switch. I was rapidly outgrowing it, but my parents couldn't afford a bed for me, so I would stay in that crib for a few more months. There were so many times when I felt a presence hovering over me. Scared, I would bury myself under the blankets for protection, the way that all small children hide under the blankets to protect themselves from monsters. Yet, my monster did not always go away. On one occasion, I felt a sharp poking at my feet, as if someone with long fingernails were tapping the bottom of my foot. At first, I pulled my feet up towards my chest, but the poking continued. It was then that I heard Charlie command, "Turn on the lights." I got up and did so. When I looked around, no one was there. Yet, when I turned off the lights to go back to sleep, the poking resumed. This time when I looked, I saw a thin hand with unnaturally long fingers moving at me. What I assumed was the skin was stretched tightly across the bones, giving it a gnarled appearance. The nails of the creature were black, with narrow, red, vein-like lines running down them. The sight of this hand frightened me so badly that I grabbed my blanket and jumped out of my crib with a leap that would have made an antelope proud. I ran to my parents' bedroom and wrapped myself up in my blanket there. Eventually, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. In the morning, I told my parents what had happened. They told me that it had just been a bad nightmare, and that there was nothing evil in my bedroom. Not long after this event, my parents got some old mattresses that would serve as my new bed. Shortly after that, a new issue began to manifest. When getting ready for his paper route, my dad noticed something odd. In the middle of the night, he would find me sprawled out across the floor of my room. At first, he assumed that this was a case of a child rolling out of bed at night. However, before too long, he became suspicious. He said he would find me in places that I could have only been in if someone had pushed me out of bed and across the floor. There were times when I would wake up with long, thin bruises across my back, as if someone's fingers had shoved me. My great-grandmother was a very religious woman and had a small mirror with a painting of Jesus on it, which she kept in the corner of the room. It had a narrow blue ribbon, so could be hung anywhere. One day, she gave this to me, telling me that a man in an old-fashioned uniform had appeared to her, saying that I should have it for protection. She even went as far as to say that the mirror should be hung next to the closet, so it would be overlooking my bed. Dad agreed and got a hook for hanging pictures. When hanging the mirror, he accidentally struck the hook one too many times, so it bent in on itself. That meant that the only way to remove the mirror would be to lift it up by the ribbon. I also kept a small framed picture of the Virgin Mary on my desk. For about a week afterwards, my room felt lighter and more open. I could play with my brother without feeling scared, and my mysterious rolling out of the bed had even stopped. However, it did not last long. After returning home from school one day, my room felt cold and oppressive again. I knew the entity was back, and it was angry. Slowly walking into my room, I first noticed my picture of the Virgin Mary was facing downward. I picked it up and placed it upright again. When I looked towards my closet, where the mirror should have been, it was gone. I worked up the courage to go to the closet and saw that my mirror had been torn off the hook and smashed onto the floor. It was in so many pieces on the floor that it looked as though someone had repeatedly stomped on it. As the hook in the wall was undamaged, I could only conclude that it must have been physically moved, lifted up by the ribbon. I told both my parents what had happened. Neither could explain it. My mom blamed it on the cat. My dad was suspiciously silent. That night, the entity lashed out by scratching my back. I fled from my bedroom, screaming for help. My experience was once again blamed on a nightmare, but I was allowed to sleep on the couch that night. At this point, I was terrified of being alone. I could feel that my brother and Charlie were with me. I made them promise to stay with me. From then on, if I was put to bed, I would stay awake until my parents went to sleep. Then I would get up and go to sleep out in the hallway, until I was discovered and forced to go back to my own bed. There I would hide under my blankets, terrified of sleep, terrified of the evil entity that lurked in the closet of my room. The entity never once spoke to me. It only ever lurked, waiting to terrorize me. I believe that it was demonic. For a long time, my parents refused to believe my claims. That was until my dad was home sick one day. He had heard a noise coming from my bedroom and went to investigate, thinking it was a cat or our dog. What he saw frightened him so much that he would not tell me what it was until years later. When I got home from school, he immediately ordered me to go play in the backyard. He told me not to argue. I could tell he was serious. I remained in the backyard until the sun began to set. During that time, I saw someone in dark robes enter and leave the house. All of my belongings were moved out of the room and placed into the spare bedroom. I was forbidden from entering my old bedroom again unless I had one of my parents with me. About a month after, we moved out of the house. Years later, my dad told me that, when he heard the noise, he went to my room to see what looked like a human heart with large fangs in the doorway. Though startled, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the eye. When he went into my room, the entity had changed into a misty figure resembling a man's body, with the heart with the fangs being where the head should have been. Instantly, my dad had slammed the door and ran to the phone. He called the priest, telling him what he had seen and asking him to do an emergency blessing on my bedroom. After the blessing, the priest warned that the best thing to do for my safety was to leave the house. So, once our lease was up, we left. About 10 years ago, I learned that the renters before us had been members of a dark cult, and would summon demonic entities in my bedroom. In particular, the closet was used as some sort of gateway for them, where the entities would enter and leave. Eventually, the people were kicked out of the house. However, the portal was never closed, which allowed the demonic entity to enter the house and terrorize me. Even to this day, I can't pass by my old house without wondering if that entity is still there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. And if you have not done so already, please click the bell to ensure that you receive notifications of new uploads. If you cannot wait for my next video, why not watch another suggested on screen now? Remember, the more you know, the more there is to fear.